Well, for those of you just tuning in, soon enough we'll get started. We're just kind of letting everyone hop on and sort out any technological problems. Sounded like I might have interrupted someone just there. I'm not sure. Our group is populating here. Everyone is showing up. For folks still waiting, I think we're missing one or two people who we want to be here, but otherwise we will get started soon. I just want to give you all a couple of notes on sort of how this works. So you might have found that you're making clever jokes and no one can hear you or respond to them. That's because upon joining this meeting, all of you are muted. So what you say isn't transmitted to the rest of us. You can interact with us via the Q&A feature, which very likely, depending on your computer, but very likely shows up in the bottom of your screen, maybe just to the left of center. And that's a way to provide questions or comments you might have on the session. Now the session will run in a relatively standard format. So we will talk with our panelists for some time first and then open things up to a broader discussion. So the time for questions will come after we've spent some time talking with our panelists. But I encourage you, when we do reach a question and answer time, to really make your ideas and thoughts known. Those are very interesting and fruitful times. And many who are attending here are well advanced in terms of pedagogy and the scholarship of teaching and learning. So all of you probably have interesting ideas and I look forward to learning from them. But in the meantime, we will begin with discussion with our panel. Before we do though, I want to take just a minute to introduce science-engaged theology. Some of you might be very familiar with it. Some of you might not be familiar with it. I don't want to spend a great deal of time on this because I do want to get on to teaching science-engaged theology. But first, just an attempt to make sure everyone is on the same page. I will address it just a bit. So I'd like to think science-engaged theology as a term came into play when John Perry was working on his first grant from the John Templeton Foundation at the University of St. Andrews. It's an exciting term. By science-engaged theology, what is intended there is using science as an authentic theological source. So using science alongside what you may already be accustomed to, such as scripture, tradition, or reason. So some theologians have hesitated to use empirical research. It seems to us that this is surprising and ought to be surprising. So the leading scientists say in the 17th century were nearly all religiously interested. Thomas Aquinas himself never ignored what we can learn from our senses. And there are sound reasons for this connection, reasons that can be stated in disparate ways in Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox doctrines. So our hypothesis, generally speaking, is that some theologians in any case fear incorporating empirical data because they worry that once they start to do so, they'll have begun on a slippery slope, a slope that might ultimately lead them to theology's distinctiveness being lost and being replaced by religious studies, so say using the methods of sociology and cultural anthropology exclusively, or the idea of science and religion, dealing with the relationship between the methodologies of those disciplines in the modern university and the competing authorities of each. Or perhaps the scientific study of religion as seen through the journal of that name. So theologians with these sorts of worries don't necessarily think that these three are problematic, but they see theology as different and something of unique value that they want to preserve, a unique value that shouldn't be lost. Those who practice science-engaged theology agree with that. However, SET also, and in case anyone's unfamiliar, we'll use the word SET, S-E-T, to refer to science-engaged theology. However, we argue that such theologians are wrong to think that any use of empirical evidence in theology will cause this slippery slope. So slippery slopes are usually fallacies. They're not always fallacies, but they're usually fallacies. And we're concerned that using any empirical evidence surely doesn't create this sort of slippery slope. So perhaps we should return to it and see what it can do for us. Sometimes you need good natural science to answer theological questions. That's right. Sometimes you need good natural science to answer theological questions. I think most of the churches I've been a part of would raise their eyebrows at me, at least living in Tennessee, if I said that out loud. Alternatively, that isn't always necessary, but it is sometimes necessary. It's a different mistake to say you always must use natural science to make theological progress. In SET, we're fond of the term puzzles. Some puzzles simply require empirical inquiry. So as an initiative, the Science-Engaged Theology Project encourages theology to be done well on those questions, not every question, but on those questions that simply cannot be fully answered without some sort of engagement with empirical science. Its hallmarks are to start with thoroughgoingly theological problems that require the theologian to be well-versed in some particular science. So some of you will be well familiar with this, but I want to make sure all of us have a sort of foundational floor here of knowledge. SET suggests some rules of thumb to help make sure that we know when we're doing this right. So this is a new field of inquiry. It would be perhaps foolish to give rules and exact methods on how to do this at this stage, but some guidelines might be helpful. So here they are. SET, when done well, should focus on individual subdisciplines. So conversations in SET are rarely about, say, science with a capital S versus religion with a capital R, but instead about something like biology and liturgy, or ecology and stewardship. Subdisciplines should be the field within which we're speaking and operating. Okay, a second rule. SET, when done well, will make use of multiple tool sets as opposed to interdisciplinary roles. That might be confusing at first if you haven't heard that before. So I'll give you an example. We don't want to say in SET, if we can help it, as a scientist, I can say X, but as a Christian, I can say Y. Instead, what we want to say is something like this. Well, using DNA testing, I can see X. But with exegesis, I can interpret the Pope as saying Y. Or we have subdisciplines working together. The third guideline is that we want to be upfront of the questions we ask of theology. Puzzles, that's a word that SET is fond of. That's a word that is selected on purpose. So when a puzzle is in front of you, you typically can tell if it's been solved or not. So as it happens, I'm sufficiently nerdy to like puzzles, literal, actual jigsaw puzzles. It's very clear when a jigsaw puzzle has been solved and when a jigsaw puzzle has not been solved. Unless you're doing some kind of particularly abstract puzzle, it's rather obvious. So instead, we think we should be upfront in similar ways. We should say what the puzzle is, what the goals are, so that it will be evident if we have solved this puzzle. We shouldn't say that we are, quote, doing theology, or something that could be interpreted in enough ways to be similarly wishy-washy. Success criteria should be relatively clear and not amorphous as much as we can make them clear. And then a fourth guideline is that we value the curiosity to keep digging in the face of anomalies. So this takes issue with an example like intelligent design. So in intelligent design, we might be too ready to call everything that isn't understood a miracle. Alternatively, we would also take issue with someone like Richard Dawkins, who is too hesitant to say something isn't fully solved and that there are anomalies we haven't explained. Last, the fifth guideline, and this might be controversial. In fact, all of these are controversial in different environments. But the fifth guideline is that we posit no in principle queen of the sciences. So we have an egalitarian platform that all these subdisciplines are standing on. So thank you for bearing with me there, but I wanted to make sure that there was at least some kind of base level currency of understanding of what is meant by science-engaged theology. Again, some of you will be terribly familiar with that and be happy and ready to expound on any of those in more detail than I did. But for others of you, this will be the first time you've heard that phrase. So I would like to make sure we all have some common vocabulary here. Okay, with that being said, I would like to move on with our discussion. So one thing I'd like to make clear is, some of you may have heard me say this before the session, but this is a new thing for the AAR. So these virtual sessions are different. When you do new things for the first time, things go wrong. So things may go wrong, technologically or otherwise, and that's okay. So you may find that you run out of battery and your computer shuts down. You plug back in and boot up as quick as you can. That's okay. You don't have to feel like, well, I can't sign back in. No, you can sign back in. Lots of things like that will happen. Undoubtedly, at some point, someone will be unmuted and not realize it, and we'll hear their dog or cat or something like that. That is a-okay. So this is a conversation, and a casual conversation will probably serve all of us better than an uptight conversation. With that being said, I'd like to move on to that conversation. So I'd like to briefly mention who our panelists are. I'll start with Dr. Andrew Davison. So some of you may know Andrew. He's got his camera on, he's easy to see there. Andrew is a Starbridge Senior Lecturer in Theology and Natural Sciences, and a Fellow in Theology and the Dean of the Chapel at Corpus Christi College. Andrew has been a voice and an advocate for SET for a long time. Andrew was part of a prior grant, as in fact everyone on this panel has been, except I think for Alex. I think he's the only person who is new in that regard. And Andrew hails from, of course, Cambridge, and we are very happy to have him here. I'll also mention Bethany. So Bethany Sollereder hails from Oxford. Now, Bethany, last I checked, you had been a research coordinator and also a postdoctoral fellow. I worry I'm not going to get your current title exactly right. Would you mind filling in that blank for me?
No problem. At the moment, I'm a research fellow in science and religion at the Laudato Si Research Institute, which is at Campion Hall. And also I lecture with the Faculty of Theology and Religion. Thank you,
Bethany. Bethany has also been involved for a long time and is a terrific individual. If this were the actual AAR, where we're going to have hallway conversations, I would encourage you to follow Bethany and ask her questions, because her anecdotes are just some of the most interesting you'll ever hear. And Joanna. So we also have Dr. Joanna Leidenhag. And Joanna, I shared an office with Joanna for some time. So I can tell you firsthand that she's a terrific individual. And Joanna's, I believe your current title is lecturer in science-engaged theology at the Divinity School at St. Andrews. And Joanna has been also a pioneer in science-engaged theology. I'm tickled to hear what she has to say. And then our last panelist is Dr. Alexandru Manafu. And you're new to me. I think you prefer Alex. Is that right?
Either way is fine. Alex is fine.
Alex, okay. And Alex is an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy at York University in Canada. And Alex has demonstrated some pedagogical excellence and actually has won one of our grants for developing his own course. So I'm also tickled to hear what Alex has to say, and I'm looking forward to getting to know him a bit better. Last, I'll just briefly mention, we also have Mikhail Leidenhag, who is, could be on this panel just as anyone else. He'd probably be better than me. But Mikhail is here to help field questions. So when we move to open discussion and you use the Q&A feature, Mikhail will sort of herd those questions and sort them and filter them and all of those kinds of lovely things and surface them to myself, and I will surface them to the panel. So Mikhail is the one doing the actual nuts and bolts of that sort of work for us. So thank you, Mikhail. All right, with all of that said, I'd like to move on to actually talking about teaching science-engaged theology. So this panel's different. It's interesting because research and teaching are not really the same thing. They often inform each other, but teaching is different. Teaching does not take place onto just a blank Word document. Teaching is something that takes place with other human beings in a classroom. It's a different skill, and it's a skill that requires different ways to hone and different ideas to carry it out, to operationalize teaching well. So this is a bit fun to hear and see what people have experienced. How do we engage students with science-engaged theology? I do want to briefly mention before I ask the first question that there's two ways one could think about this, and one of them I want to discourage and one I want to encourage. So one way you could think about this is to say, what is it to teach science-engaged theology that is different from anything else I ever teach? Though that is fruitful in some ways, I want to discourage that approach and instead encourage, what is it to teach science-engaged theology well? If we just ask that question, well, there might be things that help us teach science-engaged theology well, that would also help us teach geometry well, and that would also help us teach physics well, or English literature well, and that's okay. So we could say, what is it to teach science-engaged theology well and only science-engaged theology well? But I think then we would sadly cut ourselves off from a field of insights that all of you might have that would be fruitful. So teaching it well in a way that is anything that helps teach it well, even if those skills are replicable in other fields and domains and not unique to science-engaged theology. So I hope that distinction makes some sense. If not, we can come back to it as we move on. But yes, I'd like us to feel free to talk about what has worked and what hasn't. And it doesn't have to be something that only would work when teaching science-engaged theology. That would be an unfair way to hamstring ourselves. All right, all of that said, I'm going to ask some questions, and our panelists, you're more than welcome to simply speak up and answer. I'm not going to direct these questions at any particular one of you initially, unless one of you refuses to talk, and then I'll hound you out. But so you're welcome to simply sort of take the reins as you feel interested. So a question I'd like to begin with. When teaching science-engaged theology to students, what do students tend to struggle with? What do they tend to get wrong? What is the thing that challenges, the biggest challenge to their understanding science-engaged theology? What are the primary obstacles? Yeah, Bethany.
Yeah, I can kick off one of them. I mean, I'm not sure that it's that students get things wrong so much as they bring preconceptions to the class that take a while to get past. And whether it's a conservative student who has a very literalistic view of the Bible and feels suddenly challenged by learning that there's science that would directly challenge some of the interpretations that they've taken seriously, So I think one of the things that's really difficult about this area is that it touches directly on political and social polarizations, and it can act directly on students' identities in a way that, you know, learning about Augustine's view on X probably doesn't. And so I think that there's an extra sensitivity required in proceeding.
That's very interesting. Do any of the rest of you have something you want to add? I notice, Alex, your mic is unmuted, which makes me think you might have something to say.
I hope you can hear me now. Well, I was just going to add to that. It's not as much that we challenge. I mean, in my case, so I speak about my course, which is more like a philosophy of science course, having to do with topics that, of course, relate to the existence of God. The biggest obstacle is understanding the science. So in the beginning, I do a little bit of cosmology, and so there are some elements in the course that are harder to access for the students. So for that reason, I need to do a primer on, you know, quantum mechanics, or I need to talk a little bit about evolutionary biology, or probability theory when it comes to, for example, arguments about fine tuning and things like that. So the mathematical or the physical aspect, the scientific aspect, is something that it's a challenge, especially for students who, well, I teach in a philosophy department, so I have philosophy students, and not all of them obviously were friends with the hard sciences in high school. And I try to dissipate some of that worry and then show them that these ideas can be interesting and fun. So I do that a little bit to them, but this takes up some of the time. So time constraints are always a challenge for me as well.
That's helpful and interesting, Alex. And I
could give more details if I mean, I'm open to discussing or getting more in depth into the topics or the themes or various other things. But yeah, just some sort of you know, mix of ideas that just come to mind now. But I definitely have more.
Sure. And you actually, your comments there helpfully bring up other questions that are relevant that I'll go with now. And you're welcome to take the first answer or not, whatever you prefer. So there are two questions that I think what you said leads me to. One of them is, you mentioned all of the different topics that have to be covered and the sort of the different bits of necessary knowledge to do science-engaged theology. And I think that is a unique problem when teaching science-engaged theology, how to talk about these things if students have no antecedent understanding or awareness. And for me, where that often becomes most evident is in terms of pacing. So how do I pace a course if I need to teach students physics before I teach them the rest of it? How do I pace a course where all of these things have to come up? So anyways, the question that I'd like to put to the panel now is, how have you managed pacing in your courses? And as you answer that, I would love it if you were able to tell us a little bit about your courses too. What sort of set module or class you've taught and how pacing came to play a role in that course. Some of you have taught many set modules and courses. Of course, you can pick any one you want. But yes, how have you handled sort of the amount of information you might feel like you need to cover, and in a way that doesn't exhaust your students, that engages your students? And in telling us, it would be lovely to hear a bit about your course.
I'll start off, if that's okay, Kevin.
Sure.
I have 4 modules broadly under science-engaged theology, and how I pace them tends to differ mostly on what level they're at rather than on the specific topic or content of the course. So I noticed that in my first year modules, students typically straight from high school, I tend to focus in the first few weeks on deconstructing all of those assumptions that Bethany was talking about that they bring into the classroom. And that can be a range of things, but I find that if you don't do that at the beginning, they plague you throughout the course. So deconstructing whatever the presupposition is, and it might be science and religion, could never have anything to say to one another. One's facts, the other's values or something, or they're always at war and they must always be at war. And these kind of big, more science religion dialogue questions, actually, I find have to be, for the first years, tackled first, often with some good basic philosophy of science about what we mean by explanation and what we mean by evidence in each of these disciplines, things like that. But then as these first year courses develop, the goal is to get more and more specific, and therefore to move us from these big questions in philosophy of science and questions that have dominated science and religion more broadly to what you were introducing to us, Kevin, as more like set puzzles, more specific theological questions that require or would benefit from some scientific knowledge to understand them. And so far I've, for one first year course, it's called Science and Religion and the Mind, we focus on a group of questions all to do with the mind in the second half, but each week we kind of tackle a different puzzle, a different specific question to do with, say, mental illness, or to do with positive psychology, or to do with mind uploading and transhumanism. Those sorts of, they kind of cluster together, and so you're building knowledge, but there's also a kind of different puzzle each week. But as I teach courses that are more higher level, so final year undergraduates or first year master's students, then from the get-go, we're just doing more specific stuff. So I teach one called Holy Scripture, Sacred Earth, that's about bringing the Bible and the science behind ecology together. And from there, it's quite a different tactic in that we just get the basics of ecology and the basics of biblical exegesis and biblical studies down, and then move in a much more detailed way through different books of the Bible and different aspects of ecology. So it's kind of what would be 1 week ridiculously done too quickly in a lower level course, we spend an entire semester on in an upper level course, as it were. So I don't know if that helps answer your question.
No, I think that was helpful and interesting as well. I particularly resonate with what you said about sort of needing to clear ground to make room for science-engaged theology, sort of iceberg-style presuppositions that are floating in students' minds. I think, Andrew, you might have raised your hand as well. I want to make sure that you get a chance to speak up here too.
So, can you hear me all right? I think that in a sense I have a lot to learn from you, I'm sure, when it comes to a particular method with science-engaged theology, because the things that I've implemented in my course I did quite a few years ago. I think being inspired by many of the same concerns that lie behind this project and things that I spoke to John about from the beginning. But in terms of more detailed pedagogical method, I'm sure I've got a lot to learn from the session today. The story basically is that I used to have a second year paper which was a standard old-fashioned science and religion paper that was about a third methodology, a third physics, and a third biology, and tried to survey the field. And then my third year paper was much more specific, and it was about biology, specific science, and a focus particularly on what does it mean to be a human being from a theological perspective in light of various bits of contemporary science. And I think my big set move was simply to drop the second year paper. So I'm not in the business of trying to do anything that is so comprehensive that I can't look at anything in detail, and that all of that stuff about possible taxonomies about how science in general might be able to relate to theology in general has gone. I just moved away from the idea that there is science in general or that there's theology in general. So in terms of then what that means, I just don't try to do everything. I have one theological module in the paper to start things off, asking what does it mean to be a creature, not just a general theology of creation, but what would be a theology of creaturehood. And then I choose 5 topics. So they're the human being after evolution, the human being after neuroscience, technology and transhumanism, non-human animals and relation between creatures, and life elsewhere in the universe. So broadly all biological. And even within them, I'm not claiming to be comprehensive. There's no more than 3 lectures for each one. So the neuroscience one, for instance, which I've just finished lecturing, was basically the embodiment of thought. So 4 angles on what does it mean for thought to be a bodily thing, and then a lecture on brain as computer, computer as brain, and criticizing some of those analogies. So there's lots more to say, but in terms of scope and focus, it's been about dropping generalities and then a focused range of sciences, and then even within the topics that I look at, not wanting to be comprehensive, but focused enough that there's some real grit that one needs to engage with.
That's helpful, Andrew. I'd like to take your course. At the very least,
me too. I sign up.
I have shared your strategy of dropping general comprehensiveness for grit on specific topics. I'd love to talk more about that, but before I do, I want to make sure everyone has a chance to respond to this question about pacing in your module in general.
The only thing I would add to that is I generally start with history, because by the time you've gone through several case studies, say Newton, Galileo, Darwin, you don't have to ask questions like, are science and religion always at war? Because you've just shown how they can work together and how they can sometimes conflict, or how particular sciences and particular theologies and, you know, how a life of faith can live alongside a life of science. So I use history to do a lot of the heavy lifting for methodology for me.
If I could respond to that, I think you're absolutely right. And the heroes of the last 10 or 20 years have often been the scientists who have shown that there doesn't have to be a history, that doesn't have to be antagonism, because for so much of human history it wasn't. And so the part of that paper that I've dropped that I most regret not having is the opportunity to go through quite a lot of history. So I try to bring some history in, like have a lecture on what does it mean for human beings to be animals, and we look at that quite a lot of what I do with a historical mindset, I suppose. But it is the one regret of turning towards so much specific contemporary science is that I can't paint the historical picture in quite the way I would want.
I want to check, Alex, did you have anything you wanted to add here?
Yeah.
You certainly don't have to.
Yeah, just briefly. I was fascinated by the selection of topics in Andrew's course. I'm not sure to what extent we can have arranged to share our selection of topics. It sounds incredibly interesting. And I concur with what the panelists have said so far in terms of choosing topics that are focused. And that's the recipe for me to stay on track and make sure that I respect the timetable and the schedule, right? So in my case, again, I stayed away from including grand topics like, is science compatible with religion? I find that question almost ill-formed. The relationship between the two is so complex that I don't find it particularly useful. Instead, I prefer to ask more precise and narrow questions, such as, was the universe caused to exist? And I look at readings from philosophy of physics in particular. So often, I mean, always I choose to, because this is a philosophy course, so the assumptions are not in any way ideologically committed to atheism or to theism. So we try to place ourselves somewhere, you know, in a position where to assess the arguments rationally. And this is the case for all the topics that I chose in my course. So I can go briefly through them. So I start with the philosophy of cosmology and whether the universe was caused to exist. And then there's another question: does God explain the existence of the universe, which is closely related to that. And I also stay in the realm of philosophy of physics. But then I ask questions about miracles. How are we to understand miracles? Do miracles involve violations of the laws of nature? And then I ask a more specific question: do miracles involve violations of the principle of conservation of energy? And then I move on to the mind. So I'm looking at near-death experiences. Do such experiences pose a challenge to scientific naturalism? And then I look at scientific explanations of religious belief and behavior, such as evolutionary or cognitive. Can science explain away religion? And then I look at arguments about fine-tuning, the anthropic principle, intelligent design, and I end with Plantinga's argument against naturalism, which stems from evolution. So he performs that wonderful turning of the tables against the evolutionary atheist, where he uses evolutionary science to argue against naturalism. So that's the the structure of the course. And again, I reiterate that a method to just do good time management is to choose particular manageable topics with just a couple of readings, not more than that. And that's how I stay on track.
Thank you, Alex. Your course also sounds very interesting, though it also sounds busy. I'd like to follow up with a question about zooming in and getting into topics where we have friction, and students can really see what it's like to try and make progress on some issue, versus feeling a need to cover topics universally, and how we balance those. I'd also like to link that. You're certainly welcome to address one or the other, but to another question, and that is, how have you navigated SET in terms of colleagues' response? Of course, this will be different at different universities. So in my environment, for example, at Lee University, a small liberal arts university, there's quite a bit of attention that colleagues pay to each other's courses. And some of those colleagues are more resistant to change than others. And when you're doing something new, you have unique opportunities and unique threats. And in particular, if you're taking, say, a course on science and religion and sort of shoehorning SET into it, you might be saying, I'm going to drop a lot of topics that normally happen in this course. How have you managed to teach SET without rocking the boat too much? Or has that not been an issue at your particular institution? How have you gone about teaching something new and different in an environment where your colleagues might not expect that or might be resistant to it? So at that question, and as far as my experience goes, zooming in on particular topics has required me to be aware of that dynamic. Because if I want to teach an entire course on what, say, certain kinds of group psychology have to say about how groups function, and compare that to what we might learn in ecclesiology about how religious groups function, that's very different than what my colleagues are used to hearing, even though it zooms into a place where there's some grit. So how have you balanced these competing tensions of trying to teach something new while perhaps people being resistant to change, and that it's a bit necessary to teach something new to do SET well, and if you're going to zoom into something specific?
Thanks for that question, Kevin. I've actually found that the move towards more what we're trying to argue for as more explicitly science-engaged theology has helped with this in a number of ways. So my colleagues have been very welcoming of having a course that's elective and not compulsory for the students, that's kind of more broadly science and religion in the mind, the one I was just mentioning. The advantage of this course is that in the Scottish system, in the first and second year, any student can take any course from any school. So I think this semester, I've just finished teaching this course, I think 80% or something of the class, which was over 90 students, came from outside divinity. And a lot of them from the natural sciences. So when he says this, I think it's quite welcome to have a divinity module that's drawing on so many students from other schools. And this may well be the only course they take, though my hope is they'll enjoy it enough to take more divinity courses afterwards, obviously. But I've actually found, so that's fine to have one, like a kind of drawer course. But the best way, I think, to get the more precise courses into debates around what offerings we should make and the syllabus decisions that are department-wide decisions, is that I team up with other colleagues. So the Sacred Earth Holy Scripture course, I co-teach with an Old Testament professor. And because he cares about how the Bible is used in terms of ecology and the environmental crisis. And in fact, he approached me to say, I need some science in this course and I need some theological reflection on that science to bring into this otherwise biblical studies course. Let's plan this together. Similarly, I teach a course with one of my colleagues who specializes in theology and literature. And we teach a course on how science and theology interplay in the history of literature. So looking at Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and the Divine Comedy, all the way to Mad Max, the movie, and Interstellar, right? Christopher Nolan's Interstellar. So and trying to track how the imagination and the arts together interweave science and theology, right? So my overall answer that I'm trying to give you is that co-teaching has been a great way for me to integrate science-engaged theology more into the department and work with my colleagues. And this, in fact, helps us be more specific in many ways.
Thank you, Joanna. Bethany, I think you were raising your hand.
Just to say, all of that was wonderful. Thank you, Joanna. One additional mechanism that I use is what we have here, a course called Further Studies, which is essentially an independent study course. So you have a specific question, you have a specific student who's interested in that, and they can take that course directly with me. I don't know how much other people have that, but I've often used that to look at a more specific focus set of research with a particular student.
Fascinating. So you're getting students one-on-one when you teach SET, and not always a collective classroom of students.
Yeah, I mean, we have that to some extent with the tutorial system anyways. So although I'd have a large lecture room of students, I would have a smaller group that I would do one-on-one or small group tutorials. And with those, I generally have, 4 essays that they'll write me that will be on a topics that I know will come up on the exam. And then often for the last several, I'll simply say, hey, pick a topic that you're interested in. I won't give you a reading list. You have to go research this yourself. So if they do well at that task, then I'm more confident to take them forward to further studies where they would essentially be doing the same thing on a longer scale.
I envy your opportunity to do that. Okay, and Andrew or Alex, do either of you have something you wanted to add?
In my case, my colleagues are very friendly. So instead of having any interference, I had a lot of support. Actually, this course that I mentioned called Science, Nature, and God, it's a 4th-year seminar in the philosophy department. is a course that I created. So it's a new course. Actually, I benefited from the grant, course grant. And I had a lot of support, and both from the level of the department and the level of the university actually for it. Yeah, it's a fairly large institution. So as it happens in larger institutions, there's less interference, I find. And there's plenty of room for everyone to teach everything. So I guess we don't step on each other's toes in my department.
Happy to hear that.
I just say that I found my colleagues to be very supportive of what I try to do with this course. That's partly because we have a culture, I think, at Cambridge of letting people do papers that are tied to their area of expertise, and we receive helpful guidance and feedback from our colleagues. But if there are papers that I'm co-teaching, then they need to be negotiated. But I think we're pretty much trusted to be able to do the advanced papers off our own areas of specialism. I'd say it goes even further back, in as much as when I made the pitch for my lectureship, it must be almost exactly 8 years ago, I said, I'm a scientist who became a systematic theologian, and I've got a foot in those two worlds. I'm not a hyphenated theology and science person. So what you get from me, if you appoint me, would be theology that draws on science. And I think that's what got me the job. So in a sense, they knew what they were getting from even before I arrived. And I think it was probably pretty central to landing the position in the first place, to be honest.
That's very helpful. I have another question that also received a question from the audience. I'm going to go ahead and include now because it's apt. I think it fits with this next question of my own. The next question was, what has been, this is sort of a fun question, your biggest win teaching set? What has been a conversation with the students, the course assignment, the lecture, whatever, that was your most successful moment? I hesitate to posit it that way because I don't want it to seem like an evaluation, but rather just sharing what has been a particularly meaningful or successful moment in SEM. And the question we had from an audience member, I suspect that Bethany might have an answer to that might be one of her biggest wins. Now, granted, Bethany might have lots of bigger wins that I'm unaware of, so maybe I'm short selling her biggest win. But the question from the audience, this is from Natalia Randuik, was, do any of you use the puzzle model in your teaching of scent? And if yes, how do you do it? Or how do you make it work? Now again, I'm putting words in your mouth, Bethany, but I think you might have a big win that answers that question.
That's very kind. And it's one of my very few, I think, innovations is I do use a sort of puzzle model and ask the students to interact with me in building how the class looks. So I said in tutorials, I'll do that thing, but I have one particular lecture that I really enjoy, which is literally a choose your own adventure class on theodicy. So I did it on my PhD topic. So I have fairly comprehensive knowledge of what most people come up with. And I prepared a set of slides that's just everything I know and have a printout of them. And so as I go through, I ask students, I pose questions about how they would solve particular questions in theodicy. And depending on how they answer, I flip to those slides that I've prepared. And so our way through the material is actually mediated by what the students bring. And occasionally they'll come up with something that I hadn't prepared a slide on, and then I use the whiteboard and take down notes and add that to the crew. But what it means is that every single time I do that class, it's different for me. So I stay engaged, I stay in there. And then the students also are having real input into the outcomes of how the class works and where we go.
Thank you, Bethany. That sounds like a terrific idea. I am aware in the SOTL literature that when students have a sense, in any case, of buy-in of having some control in what they're learning, that engagement tends to skyrocket. So what you're doing there, I'm sure, creates a sense that the students are in control and garners their buy-in, and likely creates far more engagement among the students than otherwise.
Yeah, and of course the trade-off is that I'm far more vulnerable because I've given up control. And I think that that's always what we're trying to do in teaching, right? We're always trying to create space where the students can fill the space and can learn. But it certainly makes one feel vulnerable when you think, I have no idea how this will go, and if they don't participate, we cannot fill this time.
That is true. You are sort of taking a risk on yourself in order to deliver a higher quality learning experience. I'm in your corner there. I think that's a terrific idea, but it does require a certain kind of confidence. I wonder, our other panelists, what your biggest win, now that may not be for you, how you engage puzzles. That may not be your biggest win. But what has been sort of a culminating moment for you in teaching SET?
I may jump in if I may. It's always at the end of the course, so it's around this time actually of the year, of the semester, when the students in the private discussions that I have with them, or in class, actually confess to me that this course is really interesting. Actually, it made me think and reevaluate some of the beliefs I had. So most philosophy students, perhaps it's fair to say that most of them are not really struggling with the question about the existence of God at this stage. May have been one of the questions that motivated them to study philosophy, but by the time they arrived in their fourth year, this question somehow has dissipated, or perhaps they are committed atheists, some of them. Perhaps some of them have just moved away from the question. And this course is really upsetting in a good way. It's making them rethink and reassess some of their beliefs. And especially that the arguments come from the hard sciences. So the infusion of theology into the course that's contrived is non-existent, right? So we are just embarking on a quest, a scientific quest of the world, of the human mind, and you find some surprising conclusions. So that's always actually rewarding for me to see how the students kind of turn around and reconsider this question. And some of them even decide to pursue graduate studies and further investigate these questions.
Thank you, Alex. Looks like, Andrew, you've unmuted your mic.
Yeah, I was thinking that maybe I'm just one step away from the method that you're trying to elaborate here, but maybe not. So, for instance, I was thinking, do I use puzzles? Well, I suppose I pose the question: if we take this scientific finding, what does it mean? What can we not wheel out of having to think through? I suppose it's maybe a little bit less coming to a particular answer. It's not sort of set out in that puzzle way, but I think it's pretty similar territory. But I just pull back and say, I think the two things that come to mind is there was a student a couple of years ago who it really looked like he was going to follow his theology degree by retraining as a natural scientist, because he kind of got bitten by the bug. And in fact, he's actually come back to the faculty this year and is doing an MPhil with a theology and science focus. And I think we'll probably go into something like environmental consultancy. So when you feel like people's trajectory and perhaps even a sense of vocation has changed, that's a pretty, feels like a win. Although I suspect that is not at all new. I mean, good teaching ought to do that from time to time. I think when I come across supervision essays and I think this is as fresh as things that I read in science, in journals, you know, in Theology and Science or Zygon or something, and actually often somewhat fresher. That feels like a win, absolutely. So they're the two things that come to mind.
That's helpful, Andrew. And as someone who's reported on grants before, it seems as though there must be a way for us to capture those in such reports. I know that our funding agencies care about courses taught and about research produced, but it seems as though a student going on and choosing to pursue a career in this area should be an outcome there as well. That's very exciting. Was there any last input on that question before pivoting to another one?
Yeah, I wanted to say, quickly, I broadly agree. The things that stand out to me as biggest successes are when students switch into divinity or continue on with divinity or science-engaged theology beyond the end of the 10 or 11-week course. But also, and this ties in a bit to Natalia's question about puzzles, is so if I think just about the course I've just finished, I think the biggest win I had was when a student emailed me. So the topic for the week had been about how should Christians think about depression in light of contemporary psychology and neuroscience. And so this is already something like a puzzle or getting towards it. It's not quite specific enough yet, but it's certainly starting off with a theological problem or area of investigation. And we had laid out all the kind of standard theological answers here, and then we're trying to bring in some of the contemporary and cutting edge natural science to inform those theological questions. So that had been what the week was about. But what I thought was the win for me is when a student emailed me to say that they had a relative with dementia and could they do exactly the same kind of approach, but instead look at how theology should help our understanding of what dementia is and how we should respond to it pastorally, and how our theologies about, and they put this in the email, right, how our theologies of what memory is and how maybe Augustine's stuff about God in the memory should inform what it means for a person to lose their memory but retain their faith. And anyway, it was not all perfectly worked out, but it was a clear evidence of a student who had applied many of the principles and the ideas, the big ideas that we're trying to teach them in these courses, to something that mattered to them personally in their own life. So, you know, I jumped off my seat with joy when I saw that email, and was of course delighted to tell the student, you can write an essay on that instead, that would be great, you know. So when they own it like that, I think, which is partly what Bethany was talking about, that gives me great joy.
That's terrific, Joanna. I'm very happy to hear that. I have not had anything quite that meaningful in my own teaching. That's very special. I'm glad that you were that student's instructor. I think you're going to be uniquely good at fostering that. So I have to pause and say here that by answering one question from the audience, I suppose I let the cat out of the bag, that I'm happy to bring questions from the audience to bear. And they're coming in. So what I'll do now is I'll ask simply one more question off of the non-audience list, and then we'll pivot to audience questions. And should we have time, we'll go back to some of the questions I prepared. So one final question here from me, and then we will go back to, go to audience questions with mine as a fallback. So the question I want to ask is one that I hear from colleagues when I describe SET, and is a way that SET is pushed back on. Not as a meaningful field of research or anything like that, but as whether or not it's something that's feasible or simply doable from a professional perspective. So when describing SET, some seem to worry that in order to teach SET, or at least teach it well, one will need to spend an utterly impractical amount of time staying current in empirical science. And I wonder, is that really even the case? If it is the case, have you found any creative solutions to that problem? Some of you have partnered with colleagues, that's come up. Is that a possible solution? Or again, is this a false problem? But yes, when I'm trying to motivate colleagues to be more interested in teaching SET, they seem to be afraid that SET will require them to do far more work than they simply have time to do, because it's bringing different subdisciplines together, not just picking one subdiscipline, but two, and one from a whole different field, namely the natural sciences. How do you respond to that? Is it a problem for you? If it is, how do you manage that problem? Or should I tell my friends and colleagues that's a non-problem? And if so, tell me what to tell them.
Can I jump in to that one?
Absolutely, Andrew.
So I think I would be pretty unapologetic about saying to do the best interdisciplinary work, one has to be willing to be really up to speed with the two things that you're bringing together, unless sometimes certain forms of collaboration can help with that. So I would say if someone was working in theology and literature, then they really need to, know the plays of Shakespeare or the films of whoever it is, or the poetry of whoever. That this is the precondition of that sort of interdisciplinary research. And so it's not for everyone, but for those for whom it is, then there's a certain amount of work involved. So I'm pretty unapologetic about saying that to do interdisciplinary work well, you have to immerse yourself in two fields. I think that that doesn't necessarily mean that one has to have the formal qualification in both fields. I think that's that is a good way in, but there are people on this panel who are undisputed experts in an area of overlap with science and theology, who've read their way into the science as a theologian. So that's perfectly possible. But I think we shouldn't be too apologetic about that, or what do I mean? Draw the sting, because it's actually just the shape of academic research, it seems to me.
That's helpful, Andrew. It looks like Bethany has something to add.
Yeah, I mean, as a theologian who's tried to read my way in, I think there are one or two scientific subdisciplines where I could at least not sound like a total and complete idiot. But the fact is that I use a lot of shortcuts. So I go to conferences, I listen to papers, I take scientists for a pint and ask them my endless stream of questions. So it does take time. But there are podcasts, there are lots of resources actually that you can dig into these topics at a level that's high enough, maybe not to do advanced research on it, but certainly to teach a course that can get you to the point of being able to talk about a subject that you're not familiar with. So, I mean, most of my reading into the sciences has been in biology, but I still have to teach occasionally on physics, and I haven't done anything past high school mathematics. And so there I'm relying on the excellent resources that are available through free media, whether it's watching colleagues' lectures or the various podcasts and that sort of thing.
Oh, that's very interesting. The idea of having sort of shortcuts or hacks even find our way into contemporary science seems like a very important strategy. I think Alex has unmuted his microphone.
Yeah, well, I just keep it unmuted just in case I have something to say. Well, for me, the challenge has been reversed, actually. So I arrived at theological questions from philosophy of science, from philosophy of physics. So these questions, the issue of, I mean, of course, you need to brush up on the science, and of course, I'm not equally qualified or expert in all the areas that I address in my course, but these questions have emerged from a close engagement with the sciences. But my problem is, how do I feel I don't feel as confident in my grasp of theological notions. So I'm looking to brush upon that actually. So that's my quest currently. I feel like there's plenty of extremely interesting and stimulating material in that area. And just growing up, and from my tradition, I just did not absorb enough. Growing up in communist Romania, religion was quite kept quite under a certain bar, and you couldn't express, and people were, it was frowned upon, to say the least. So I did not benefit, if you want, from religious education, and I feel that that's missing in my case. So I'm always looking for opportunities to consolidate my knowledge in that area.
Thank you, Alex. Did you have anything to add to this, Joanna? No. Okay. Excellent.
I think, can I just jump in and say that I think that, well, for instance, Bethany is probably underselling herself here, and I think that she, far from being the exception, in fact, it proves the rule that she's got to where she is as a theologian by doing all that work of attending to the science. So that, I think that she exactly embodies that. It does really, though, I think she's got a very important point about what are the, I wouldn't call them hacks or shortcuts, but what are the mediating sources that really do a responsible job with the science, but are also models of clarity. And I was just looking at my shelf and I was thinking, okay, so one of my sections is on mutualism and forms of cooperation as well as competition in nature. And I looked at the shelf and I thought, yeah, here are 3 books that I really prize that are absolutely on the money with the science, but are beautifully written and communicative and absolutely the best of both worlds. And then also a couple of books that are, I suppose, more at the level of the review article, often multi-author. A good review article can be, extremely useful here. So I think one of the things that we could maybe most benefit from in talking to one another would be to helping one another identify or sharing the gems of the things that we've come across that really have that Venn diagram overlap of being responsible to the science and clear in communication and at the right level. I think another thing to say is that this is a great justification of the kind of model that's under discussion here, that precisely because by and large we're not trying to do everything, we can speak from the areas that we have managed to get expertise in. So I think that's another reason why this is a good approach. And then just to pick up on comment that Alex made, I think the point about students not necessarily, or us not necessarily having the theology at our fingertips is particularly important too. In universities that, unless they're divinity schools of a certain sort, probably don't have a set curriculum by which you're marched through, or let's say within Christian theology, the great topics in systematic theology. And so I have students in even my 3rd year course who have perhaps done very little Christian theology up to date, and that can be a real challenge. So it's not necessarily the science that's the new thing for them. And I find that particularly when it comes to something that really is a new paradigm in the science. So have a lecture on developments in evolutionary thought in the last 15, 20 years, the whole idea of an extended evolutionary synthesis, the ways in which the modern synthesis is being really tested and expanded beyond. Well, I think there's hardly an area in that isn't of real theological relevance. There's almost nothing in that doesn't look like a bullseye in terms of the kinds of things that theologians are interested in. But I find that it's not a good topic to set for supervision essays. They love the lecture, I think. They love the class we do on it. But the science is just too new. And then because no one's really done there was a volume I edited of a journal just this last week came out on it. So there's some people are doing this, and it's important work that people are doing, but it's such early days that we have the benefit that there aren't these tram lines there that people are kind of unhelpfully guided by. That can sometimes be the case. But I think if it's basically, here's this fantastic new even paradigm in science, and it bears upon all of theology, go out and tell me where the connections are. There's just too much novelty there, I think. It might work very well for a PhD thesis, but and the point I'm getting around to is sometimes it's the students just haven't got the comprehensive view of the theology as much as the science. And when those two things come together, that is a kind of surfeit of novelty, I suppose, and of possibility.
Thank you, Andrew. Well, at this point, I mentioned I would take some of those audience questions that are trickling in. The first one is a relatively straightforward question, and this one comes from Aaron Kidd. And Aaron Kidd says that these courses all sound fascinating and wants to know if the panelists would be willing to share their syllabi now or sometime later. So I will leave that to follow up after this session. But I wanted you to know that there is some desire for you to share your syllabi if you're comfortable doing so. So happy to follow up on that administratively after the session.
Kevin, can I ask a question? I actually wanted to ask this question whilst Andrew was just talking, and it relates to Aaron Kidd's just point there. I was just wondering how other panelists, in light of the recent discussion we've just had, sorry to interrupt you a bit there, Kevin.
No, it's totally all right, Joanna.
What do you set for readings? Because, like, do you ever set, or have you ever set just a scientific article? I've only done this once. And that's the primary. So what I typically have is one absolutely compulsory reading and then 3 or 4 extra readings for keen students, or if they're writing an essay on the topic, they might want to use the extra readings, etc. But typically there's only one absolutely essential reading which they all have to do. And therefore I've always got this difficult choice between a theological primary text, as it were, some like a section of Aquinas or something, a scientific journal article or a summary of the science of something like that, or a kind of one of these like hybrid articles or sections from a book or chapters or whatever that's already doing the work, a secondary piece of literature from the science and religion or science engaged theology dialogue. And I find it's always a tension between which do I go with? And I'm wondering if any of you have that experience too, or what ways you found around that. What do you ask your students to read would be the quick way of asking that question.
Oh, if I may jump in my case, looking at the syllabus, there's one article that's published in a science journal. In particular, it's Paul Bloom's article titled "Religion is Natural," published in Developmental Science. So I try to, as much as possible, not assign readings that are very inaccessible. And it's not the case for this one. This one is very accessible, even though it's a purely scientific article. But I do have other reading assignments from physicists, for example, but who published in, say, companions to Science and Religion or other similar venues.
I just want to say it kind of works differently in Oxford and probably Cambridge, where we don't necessarily assign reading for lectures. And for my tutorials, I can just give them a full page bibliography with everything I want and let them go at it. So I don't give, you know, one specific reading necessarily. So I'm sorry, I don't have a good answer for you in this context. But I think I guess in seminars we might do something more like that. But then at a seminar level, it's usually graduate students, and I would give them a science paper if I felt that was what was needed.
I think I would talk about the value of a good review scientific review article. I set those relatively often. I have a rule in lectures, especially if people are coming to see me and they're saying, should I take your paper or not? And I'm trying to help them appreciate what the scientific component. And I say, if you never read scientific pages in the newspaper, if you see a scientific story, you just skip over it. This isn't the paper for you. If you read those sorts of stories, that is a great sign that you'll enjoy the course. And I say to them, there'll be lots of diagrams, but there won't be any equations. So I think I would have, that would be a rule for me in my discernment, that I wouldn't, the look on the page is really important. And if it was an article that just had lots of Greek letters and squiggly symbols, I think I would be, I just think that it would separate the students between those who had higher maths and those who didn't in a way that I don't think is fair. So that's quite an important bar for me in terms of what I set. It does make me think that I probably set too much of what I hope I wasn't too rude in saying that kind of hyphenated science and theology literature, and that's because the students do like some sort of template. They do like some examples of integration. I think if I just said to them, here's some theology and here's a scientific article, go and write about it, I think they would feel too exposed, especially particularly if they're new to the theology. Actually, I think if I set the mediating literature, it's more because they are not so up to speed with the theology rather than because of science. But I think when it comes to sharing bibliographies and these kinds of ideas, this is where we'll all benefit a great deal from one another, but I think particularly on this question.
Thank you, Andrew. Our next question from the audience came from Preston Hill. And Preston asks, how have you helped your students shift from generic, quote, science and religion framework to a more concrete set approach that employs puzzles and subdisciplines and so on? So how have you helped them shift from a generic science and religion way of seeing things to a more concrete approach using puzzles and subdisciplines?
So I did say that I do have this first year paper that does the more typologies and standard questions and standard issues in the first half and then moves to set in the second. But none of my other papers do that. None of my other modules do that. And I think what I've learned is that if you don't teach them to think in terms of Barber's typology, then they don't. And it's kind of there in the background, but if you don't help them formulate it, then we never have to go there and then go through there, because it is hard to unlearn. I think we find that as a whole field. And instead, at least I think this has worked well in the other courses that I've done, better than actually this first year paper, is just getting on with it. And just asking them theological questions with science in the mix, or scientific questions with theology in the mix, and not starting the conversation with the problem of, can we do this and how do we go about it? I think it makes a lot more sense to ask those sorts of questions, if at all, to ask them at the end of the module, after they've been doing it for 10 weeks. And then they can think back about the contours of the sorts of ways of thinking that they've tackled in different areas that the course has covered. But I'm moving towards that anyway, increasingly in my teaching. I used to, as I said, I have been dealing with some of those issues up front in some of these modules, but I'm moving towards maybe we should be dealing with them at the end. And in some courses, maybe we should not be dealing with them at all. Because you can just then drop them straight into the set more way of thinking, rather than going first, we're going to talk about science and religion in general, and then we're going to get more specific. That can be counterproductive, I've actually found, much to my surprise. So there are different struggles with just starting more specific, particularly, as Andrew has said, concerning background knowledge. And like him, I found background knowledge in theology far weaker than background knowledge in science. My students don't know. Some of them don't know that the Bible has two halves, two testaments, or that or any, really basic theological claims. So there can be some struggle with getting everyone on the same page around that sort of thing. But yeah, I would say not seeing it as we start off with science and religion and then we move on to set, but just start with set would be seems to me increasingly to be the better way forward.
Thanks, Joanna. I really like that idea of just starting straight out with set. Andrew.
I think we can take a good lead here from the philosophy of science. So just looking at the books that people publish, there are fewer books that are claiming to be some kind of generic philosophy of science, and a real flowering of books that are philosophy of biology, philosophy of physics, philosophy of earth sciences, perhaps. So in a sense, the philosophy of science, I think, sets a good example here and has a great deal of credibility, that there is just less of a sense that there is science as one thing which has a unified philosophy. And I think that's what we're trying to do from a theological perspective. So that helps. Also, I think on the side of theology, people recognize that Christian theology, for instance, to stick with Christian theology, is contested. So it's not like it's unified on the side of the theology either. And that the whole move, I suppose, towards a theology of retrieval and the idea of turning to particular texts and being resourced by particular texts. It's interesting that we're at the same time as a theology becoming much more ecumenical, and the sense that Reformed people will read Aquinas and, a Franciscan might have a respect for Calvin or whatever. At the same time that there's this sort of ecumenical move, it's parallel also a turn to specific texts. I speak from a particular context, it may be different, but I think that's an international feature. So I think from the side of the theology, it's not that difficult to say that there is no theology in general for science to be in dialogue with. And I think I would point to the philosophy of science as an example of there not being a single scientific paradigm that we need to be. I mean, that seems to be the great weakness of not the weakness, but these taxonomies, they were too unified on both sides, it seems to me.
Well, if I recall correctly, one of our panelists will have to leave here in about 6 minutes or so. So Bethany, I wanted to give you a chance if you had anything to say to this question or anything else to make sure you get a chance before you have to slip out.
I don't really, not on this one.
Okay, fair enough. I just wanted to make sure you had a chance to get your buzzer shot in. Alex, did you have anything to say to this question, or should I move on to the next?
Not in particular, so feel free to move on.
Thank you. Okay, our next question comes from Sarah Lane Ritchie. And Sarah asks, do any of you perceive any difference, strengths, or challenges? Excuse me, my Zoom chat disappeared. I warned that this would happen at some point. Okay, it is back. Do any of you perceive any differences, strengths, or challenges when it comes to teaching SET in the US versus the UK or other countries?
This one I will jump in before I have to leave. And I don't have a great deal of experience teaching in North America, but I do have a lot of North American students who come here. And so if I were to compare it that way, I would say that the benefit of the US students and Canadian students that I usually have is that they do tend to know their theology, or at least their Bible, quite well. They tend to really know it more than my UK students. But with that often comes cultural challenges around a more entrenched view of the war between science and religion. And again, as I was saying at the beginning, the sort of identity questions that are drawn up with that, or a sense that science and religion is largely an apologetic discipline. I think with the UK, there's less of a sense that there's an inherent war or that it's primarily apologetic. But I found that there's generally less sort of personal investment in it at the same time. And that's not universally true, but you know, the students are doing, because it's kind of an interesting field to take, but there's less passion, unless maybe I'm misreading British Reserve, which is very, very possibly the case.
Thank you, Bethany.
I would echo a lot of what Bethany says. I too have only taught in the UK, but I have sometimes a majority North American students, or at least always a lot. And I would say in many ways, perhaps, the UK students I get tend to be this either the people who are studying theology or the people who are studying specific scientific disciplines. So I get UK physics students quite a bit and UK psychology students quite a bit, where the North Americans can come from any discipline. They could be primarily there to do art history, whatever, sustainable development, anything. Tends to be much broader range, whereas in many ways, and I think this is because the North American students do tend to often come in with a culture war assumption that means they want to take the course, as Bethany has said, personally invested, already know, I think they know or do know a lot of the questions that we might talk about. But this, interestingly, therefore, the UK students I find can be actually more receptive to the movement towards set and specificity, because they some of them have really said to me, like, I'm a psychology student, I'm only here because I want to learn about how psychology and different people's spiritual beliefs interact, or something like that, right? And so they're really there for quite much a more specific reason. And they sometimes that goes with, and so I couldn't care less about the Big Bang. Like, can I just skip that week? I just want to know about whatever. As I said, dementia or mental illness, or what it means to have well-being or something like that. And in that sense, and then this is just from a small portion of students, as I say, all actually being taught in the UK context. But they tend to be looking for something more specific, and in that sense, set orientated already, which is quite exciting.
Thank you, Joanna. Alex or Andrew, anything to add?
In my case, I don't have experience with European students when it comes to science and theology courses, even though I did teach to European students in the past, but not this particular course. So I can't speak about that.
Well, if there are no more comments on this question, the next question I think is particularly interesting. This comes from Tobias Tanton, and he asks, some of you may have students who are training to be religious professionals or ministers. Any reflections or observations on teaching set to this particular audience?
Just a quick observation, I'm going to run off right away, is that we often think of the puzzles as systematic theological puzzles or as scientific puzzles, but I think they can be biblical puzzles as well, and that is probably where I might shift the focus a little bit more with people who are religious professionals. But I have to leave, unfortunately, to go teach. So I will say good night to you all, and thank you so much for letting me participate.
Thank you, Bethany.
Bye-bye.
It's a shame Bethany had to go right then, because I feel like my answer to Tobias's question is more her area of expertise, in that I haven't had a large portion of students training for ministry, but we do have some in the Church of Scotland who study at St Andrews as part of their ministerial training. And I've noticed they tend to be more focused on the pastoral elements immediately. So one of the set courses I teach that I haven't yet talked about actually is a revamp of a standard problem of evil course to integrate more scientific knowledge into it. So when we talk about death, we talk about actually what it means biologically to die on a cellular level as well as on a larger organic level. And we'll talk about trauma, we look at psychology and talk about trauma. So this is maybe an obvious case study in terms of what the course is about. But I've noticed in that course and in other courses, the ecology course, the general course, there's an immediate pull towards the kind of pastoral element. What will this mean for the people that I hope to care for and the people under my care? And this, I think, really enhances any academic course to think about the pastoral elements of it. There always are pastoral elements of a course that need to be attended to, though I would say they shouldn't, they should always be there up front rather than being dictating everything. But that's something I found, and I found it really to enhance as long as it doesn't overly dominate, if I can put it like that.
Thank you, Joanna. Alex or Andrew, anything to add on your experience teaching this sort of student?
Again, in my case, this question doesn't apply.
I would say that perhaps the big difference is that people who are candidates for ministry have got, you know, some number of years under their belt already, almost always, in fact, in my case, I think always, a previous degree, and sometimes, you know, a PhD. And so this is the part of the cohort where you can find people who are truly expert in some walk of science. And so that's perhaps the big difference. I can imagine that in some settings there would be, I think Bethany's very perceptive point about the sense that science and theology was really an exercise in apologetics. And I maybe from some evangelical students, I sometimes get that, but actually when I think about it, it hasn't been a candidate for ministry, the one that really sticks out. There's a student who did terrific work, but everything was taken as a sort of argument for the existence of God. And, you know, we were discussing a paper I'd written about divine exemplarity and evolution. And he would say, well, it just doesn't work very well as an argument for the existence of God. And I would say, well, it's not about that at all. You know, it's saying, if you believe that the world is a creation and everything about everything comes from God, then that includes the forms of things. And how do we square that? How do we think about that after evolution? But I think that's actually probably more to do with church tradition than to do with being a candidate for ministry. I would find it difficult to, apart from this point that some of them have got advanced scientific training, I'd say it's difficult to generalize. There are 19-year-olds who have acute pastoral interests and so on. But yeah, so I think that the thing that one is sometimes dealing with fully fledged scientists is the most significant thing.
Thank you, Andrew. Well, at this point, we have answered all of the questions from the audience that have come through thus far. And we have taken up a lot of everyone's time. So we'll wrap up here shortly. I'm going to ask one more question of my own. And in the meantime, if audience members would like to ask something of the panel, please do submit that via Q&A as they answer this question. So my question to the panel now is this. So none of us has enough time, and the precious little we have must be carefully managed. Teaching set is not necessarily the same as researching set. Are these two distinct in your academic work? If so, how have you balanced them? Or if not, how have you integrated them? So I'd like to know, given the scarcity of time that we have, for you, if teaching and researching set are the same, how have you integrated them? Or if teaching and researching set are distinct in your work, how have you balanced these two as separate things? I didn't mean to accidentally ask a hard question here.
Well, I would say it's not a particularly hard question, that because it's also specific and it's quite often in unexplored territory, it's where research and teaching come very close together. And I sometimes think week by week, setting these questions is a bit like having a army of research assistants, really, in terms of not only the creativity of the way of which they bring things together, but even turning up material and papers and things that I hadn't set. So in that respect, there ought to be plenty of papers where I have footnotes saying, I acknowledge here, essay by some students or other. But vice versa, it's probably an area of teaching where our research is going to be very close to the surface. So I find a great synergy between research and education according to this sort of approach.
Yeah, I agree that the best way to approach SET as any field of, when it comes to teaching and research, is to have some sort of cross-pollination. I mean, there are research questions that emerge from the seminar, the discussions in the seminar, and vice versa. There are ideas about teaching or topics that emerge out of research interests. So in my case, I have yet to, most of my research has been in what you may call traditional philosophy of science. So I have yet to do some meaningful research in this area, but there have been, I do have an idea about a certain debate that we looked at more carefully in this course, that perhaps I have something that's not completely meaningless to say about that topic. So, and actually that was interesting because the two came together when I invited the author of one of the papers. It was actually Professor Larmer, who wrote about miracles, and I invited him to give a presentation in my class. And as part of the discussion period, we engaged in some sort of dialogue. And most of the students could not contribute, but it was more like it was moving towards more like a conference kind of. But they benefited nonetheless from that. So ideally, the two should cross-pollinate, and that's how I see it. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Alex. Would you like to add anything to that, Joanna?
Insofar as it was a question about time management, I'm probably the least qualified person to answer that because I'm terrible at my time management. But I was just going to say, I completely concur with what's been said. And on a practical level, for me, that often means constantly, like for the course I've just finished, I'm already writing down in red on the syllabus what I'll do differently next year. And I do that every time I'm reading something for my research, or I come up across an idea. I go back and I write in red, maybe do this next semester on the syllabus, so that it can be constantly revised in light of what my research is, and vice versa, as I'm preparing my lectures and as students say excellent things. I'll try and immediately make a note of it, because otherwise I'll forget. So on a practical level, for me, it's about having lots and lots of tabs open on my computer, as it were, so that I don't forget. And there can be this easy cross-pollination that I think this area, science-engaged theology, really does facilitate.
That's terrific. And I actually rather like that the consensus seems to be that to teach science-engaged theology well, one must be doing some research in science-engaged theology, and that this will inform one's teaching. That's my preferred approach as well, though I hesitate to mandate it. I think it's a terrific approach. Well, it appears, I'll let Mikhail chime in here if I'm getting this wrong, but it appears that we haven't had any new questions during that bit of conversation. And I've always been taught that the very best session chairs are the ones who end either exactly on time or early. So it seems to me that in an effort to do a good job, if there are no more questions, that this is a fitting place for us to end our session. It has been a pleasure to have you all here, and I really want to thank you, Joanna, Alex, and Andrew, and I'll thank Bethany later, for letting us explore and understand your ideas and your teaching. And I really want to encourage those audience members still present to, if this is something you teach, to consider applying for one of our course development grants. You can find more information about that on our website. And similarly to where you got the link to log into this session. We're keen to promote excellent teaching and teaching of science-engaged theology, and ideally both, excellent teaching of science-engaged theology. So please do consider submitting a proposal. Okay, all of that said, normally we'd thank our panelists, but I'm not entirely sure how to applaud you on Zoom. I suppose.
Thank you, Kevin. Thanks to the panelists and to the attendants.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. I think that this is an area where we perhaps, maybe in theology in general and certainly in its relation to science, we haven't done enough thinking about pedagogy, and I hope it's a beginning of much more extensive conversations. And thank you for taking the lead.
Thank you, Andrew. All right. Well, I think on that note, you are all welcome to head out. This is officially closes our session. If you'd like to get more information on this, please don't hesitate to reach out to us via email or via our website, again, where you got this Zoom link and registered to attend. Thank you very much, and I look forward to, at least hopefully, reading some of your proposals for course development grants.
Thanks.
Lovely day.